It all started with a very simple idea. Tell the stories of how successful middle market CEOs made it to the corner office. I'm Brant Handley, founder and managing director of Resource Options International, or ROI. We're the USA's premier executive search firm focused exclusively on empowering middle market companies to attract, hire, and retain A players while transforming top executives' careers and lives. ROI's Into the Corner office is dedicated to discovering how middle market CEOs advance their career, and we're making these remarkable and sometimes quite unbelievable stories available to you for the very first time. Listen and learn about the challenges they've overcome, the interesting people they've met along the way, and the lessons learned that steered these executives' unique journey into a middle market corner office of their own. I know you enjoy these CEO stories as much as I've enjoyed recording them. So thank you for listening today. And if you like what you've heard, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to you joining me on the next great middle market CEO adventure into the corner office. Today, my guest is Adam Spiegel, Chief Executive Officer of NorthStar Anesthesia. Adam oversees all aspects of growing NorthStar's care platform and leads the company in its commitment to delivering solutions for the hospitals and surgery centers NorthStar serves. He brings more than 20 years of business development and operations experience within the healthcare industry, and prior to joining NorthStar, he served as Executive Vice President of Provider Growth at Optum, a subsidiary of UnitedHealth Group. Before Optum, Adam spent more than 15 years at the advisory board company, where he served in several different capacities, primarily focusing on general management, new product launches, and go-to-market strategies. He successfully integrated the two companies' sales and renewal organizations, managed all sales and renewals at Optum products. Adam earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from Yale University and his Master's in Business Administration from the Wharton School of Business. Adam Spiegel, welcome into the corner office.
Thanks for having me, Brant.
Great to have you here. And what part of the world do we find you in today?
I'm in Washington, D.C.
D.C., all right. Getting a little cooler there, I imagine, these days as you get closer into the winter.
Absolutely.
That's welcome, I'm sure, after those muggy summers. Well, we always like to kick things off, Adam, and understand a little bit about our CEO's early years. So tell us where you grew up and what your early family life was like.
Yeah, I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, so a little bit warmer than here in D.C. And two brothers. I was the middle of three. Both parents were in healthcare. My father started off as a radiologist and went back to school after raising three boys and decided to become a child psychiatrist. And my mother was a nurse practitioner and ended up doing family therapy over time.
Wow. So healthcare has been in your family from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
I can see how that influenced some of those decisions you made early on, and we'll get to those in a minute. Tell us about some of the things that you remember, maybe inspirational things from mom and dad, particularly with regards to the career that they chose and you eventually did as well.
Yeah, I think both parents were very hard workers. So I think it was, while family life was important, it was very important to be successful, and they saw their professional success is important to their personal success. They always felt that giving back to the community and to society, part of that is about, working hard and working in something that is meaningful to them. So I think that was important and something I took away. My father, while in the medical profession, liked business. So, taught me how to look at stocks, sort of thought about finances in a much more macro way, ran his practice. So I got a little bit of the, practice management bug from him. And my mother was always working. So she was, a shift nurse. Then she started her own practice, very entrepreneurial. And, I think that was seeing both parents be working, I think was important for me in terms of thinking about, the workforce that we have now. That's much more common, but that's something I grew up in. So this wasn't really a mental adjustment I had to make. And, thinking about raising three kids on her own and working full time was challenging for my mother. And as I think about, my teams and the things that they go through, it's given me a fair amount of understanding of what it's like to, be the provider as a full-time mom, and how challenging that can be. So I think that also had a big impact in, how I think about the workforce as well.
Good foundations there. Yeah. Any other influencers or those that inspired you during those younger years? Coaches, teachers, others?
I had my grandfather, my mother's father, ran his own business, and I think he was someone who was a big influence for me. I was an early riser, as was he. So whenever they would come to visit, they'd spend a couple weeks with us, every 6 months or so. He spent a lot of time kind of talking about work with me, even as a 8 or 9 year old, and I think that gave me a very interesting perspective on life, and he treated me like an adult back then, and sort of got me very interested in sort of economics and sort of the way that businesses are run, and that was something that definitely had a big impact on me as well.
Good mentoring there. Love that. Were you a good student in school, Adam?
I was. I always, again, sort of achievement oriented was important. And my parents definitely pushed school as part of that. So, was always very interested in school, and kind of, I always had a, innate curiosity. So I like to learn new things. It was less about grades and more about, exploring things. And I had, Arizona is not known for its fantastic public schools. And I actually went to a private high school. And that really got me interested much more so in sort of academics and learning than I had previously done. And that's, enabled me to kind of continue down the academic career.
What about other activities, sports, music, theater, other sports, things that you got involved with during secondary school?
Yeah, so I actually did a fair amount of acting when I was a kid. So that was something that I sort of did on the side and really enjoyed. And I think that's, my interest in public speaking kind of came from that. So always very comfortable getting in front of large groups. And honestly, that comes from, being in sixth grade and having to sort of be the lead in a play. I think that's probably the prime time of being concerned about how you're appearing in front of large audiences. So if you can do it when you're, getting into middle school and in front of all your middle school colleagues, I think you can do it as an adult. So that was definitely important for me. Athletics was a huge part of my high school, and I think that's really where a lot of sort of leadership came into play. I wasn't always the best player on the team, but I was often given captain's responsibilities. And, in high school, when you're dealing with sometimes kids who are older than you, that you're supposed to be sort of telling them what to do, new kids who don't quite understand what's going on as the freshmen and sophomores join the team, it can be challenging for a high school kid. And I think a lot of the lessons I learned, on the athletic field about leadership, about sportsmanship, about, encouragement, and sort of getting a team to achieve a broader goal, really helped me later in life.
Wonderful leadership foundations there too. Awesome. What about entrepreneurial things with, granddad and mom and dad kind of all being in business? Did you pursue some of those, have the ubiquitous paper route or other things that you did as a kid?
I like to work. So I think where I went was more around, hey, how do I get a job as soon as I can, with a steady paycheck? So, rather than a, entrepreneurial activity, I was a bag boy at Safeway. So, as I say, that's it's a great, these starting jobs when you're really, working for, bigger companies. For me, it taught me very early on that, you need to temper your expectations of your boss. It's
Mm.
great to have a fantastic boss, but sometimes you don't. And you gotta, as you can imagine, the head bag boy at Safeway wasn't necessarily my inspiration. Um, Somebody who I was going to learn a tremendous amount about life from. And I didn't, but I had to figure out how to navigate with somebody who's very different than me, different upbringing, different outlook on life, different work ethic, obviously, and still make sure that I was ticking all the boxes and doing my job well. And as you go through life, you're not always going to have the manager of your dreams. And I think that was those early experiences. I was a valet, had to report to the head valet. Um, when I got into the working world, people would complain about their bosses, and I was like, well, it could be a lot worse. And I think that actually really helped me in terms of, having a little bit of perspective on, what should I be getting from my leader? And that, has helped me navigate some, challenging times in the more professional world.
Was it pretty clear you'd go to college growing up?
Yes, it wasn't really a choice. So that was something sort of my parents, that was sort of their expectation. My grandmothers both went to college, which was relatively
Wow.
unusual. And so definitely academics were in the family.
So you chose to go to Yale. Big switch, big change, both geographically, as I'm sure, as well as culturally. Was that your top choice?
It was, and you look back on these decisions, and sometimes you realize how little thought you put into some of these things. I went and I explored a bunch of schools, and of course I visited Yale in May, which is it's absolutely gorgeous
Beautiful time of
in
year.
Connecticut, exactly, and it never looks like that when you're actually in school,
No.
ever. And then I had a great student guide who was funny and charming and really gave a good impression. And my experience with some of the other schools, just they were either different times of year, so it was not as nice, or the guide wasn't I didn't click as much with. So it sort of was like that's where I wanted to go, and applied early and got in. And when you sort of get in, it sort of it diminishes your desire to keep exploring other options. So for me, I loved Yale when I walked in the first time I saw it, and I really saw it as a home. Now, in retrospect, kid from Phoenix, Arizona, going to, overcast, never sunny, cold Connecticut, may not have been the best choice. Certainly, my freshman year, I may have been thinking once or twice about my decision process, but it turned out to be a great experience, and lifelong friends that I still have there, and I do think really helped me continue to love learning. And I think that's something that Yale does a great job of. I think the professors are highly engaged, motivational, and something that, while a lot of the topics and the classes I took there have absolutely no applicability to what I do now, it really that sort of pushing your curiosity was something that they continued to pique for me. So
You
really
chose to study political science. I believe that's where you got your BA.
exactly.
And what was the thinking around that? Did you think that maybe going into politics might be something you want to do? Did you always kind of have your eye on business? Tell us about kind of the thought process behind your major choice.
Yeah, I mean, one was it was the classes I liked. So part of it was honestly, I had really enjoyed my economics classes and my political science classes. And, as you start to, I wish I would say that this was, a really thoughtful plot, but at the end of the day, I love those classes. So I took more of them. And, that was sort of as I started to build. I did think that I may want to get into politics, and I was cured of that by spending a summer in DC working for a political consultant. And really, you kind of see the not so fun side of politics, which is the pollsters and the consultants and how things work. So as a profession, that definitely sort of turned me off. But again, I think a lot of the things about leading, about doing things that you care about making kind of a difference in whatever field you're in. I think that a lot of the political science drives those sort of characteristics. So I think that's what drew me to it.
What was the first job you took out of college?
So I worked for a company called the Advisory Board, and that was it's sort of like a consulting company for hospitals. So you do research for hospital C-suites, so CEOs, CFOs, COOs, about the things that keep them up at night. So what are the biggest pressing issues? And coming out of school, they would have what they called research associates. So my job was to kind of go out, find, they'd say, hey, I've got a problem, and I want to figure out let's say, I want to create a hospital within a hospital, but I don't know what to do. And you'd go out and you'd find other facilities that had done that, interview them, and kind of write it up and send it along. And that was it was a great first job because it was sort of an extension of school. And I started to learn a ton about healthcare and what the healthcare system does, what executives really cared about day to day. And I think it was a fantastic foundation for my future career.
It sounded like it probably gave you a very good overview of the whole healthcare industry.
Exactly. And I think, that it was that question, sort of what keeps you up at night, is a very interesting question because it's different than what are your priorities for the year. It's different than, what are the things that are impacting your bottom line. It really is when you wake up in the middle of the night with cold sweats, what is it going to be about? And when you hear sort of leaders talking about that when, in your first job, it really got a very quick understanding of what the real challenges are with the healthcare system.
You spent about 14, 15 years there. What kind of kept you interested, kind of stay with the same company for so long? It's a little unusual these days when people tend to jump around a lot after, the first couple of jobs.
No, 100%. And if you had asked me going in, would I stay at the same company for a long period of time, I would have thought you were crazy because, I'm an ambitious dude and, always thought that I'd be bouncing around to lots of different things. And, what I found was it was, two things. It was the culture and the people. It was this sort of, it made you feel like you were still in academia. And they had a couple of values that they really cared about that really infused in everybody that worked there. One of the biggest ones was this concept of running to criticism and the idea that, you should always be improving. And what I found was in every role that I was in, I was constantly getting feedback from my peers, from my subordinates, from my superiors, and it made me better. And that was something that you just don't always find. And for me, was incredibly valuable in terms of my career, which was I was constantly learning, and I was constantly learning not just about the industry but about myself. What are the things I do well, what are the things I do poorly, and very clear and honest with that feedback. And I think that sort of kept me driving and feeling like, hey, I'm not stalling out. I'm sort of constantly on the steep end of the learning curve. They had a real fun foundation about meritocracy was the other piece, which was, you can keep getting promoted. So it wasn't about your degree or your, experience. It was about, hey, is this somebody who's consistently performing at a high level? And if so, we're going to give them more stuff. And that was kind of the other piece, which every time I started to feel like I was sort of flattening out on that learning curve, I got promoted or I got put into a different role entirely. And that was super exciting for me. So, culturally, that was important. And then the second piece was the people I worked with. I got to work with incredibly smart people, incredibly talented in ways that I could never, hope to be in a lot of different areas. And there were also fun people to work with. So, what I found was, to my surprise, and it shouldn't be a surprise, but, how much importance is around the people you work with. If you are surrounded by people who you like, who you enjoy, work is so much better. And it's a place that, hey, the company might be doing poorly, you might be going through a tough stretch from a business perspective, but if you're with people you like to work with, it's fine. You can get through it. You get through the low times, and then the high times are great. And when you're working with people who you don't enjoy as much, it's very different. It's a very different story. And I think that for me was the reason why I stayed as long as I did.
Adam, were you given leadership responsibilities early on, advisory board?
I was. So, I'd probably worked there about a year when I got into my first management position.
Great. And what were some of the lessons that you learned or maybe challenges that you had during those first couple of years?
Yeah, the biggest thing for me was learning that other people learn differently than I do. So, the example of this was and want to be managed differently. So in my first managerial job, it was, again, this research position. And what I would do is you'd kind of get a research project, you do the research, you'd write up the paper, you'd hand it into your manager, and they would basically, it's like an editor. They would edit the paper and give it back to you. And they tell you, here are the things you did well, and here are the things you did poorly. And we were on a productivity system. So you had to, the more projects that you put out, the better you did. And so it used to drive me crazy because I'd go in and I'd sit with my manager and they'd spend a whole bunch of time telling me all the great things about my project. And then they'd get to the part where they give me my edits. And, I'm just like, just tell me what I did wrong so I can go fix it, right? It's like, I don't need to hear all the fluff. Just tell me what I did. So when I became a manager, of course, I didn't do the positive stuff. I just gave everybody their edits, and said, hey, look, here's what you did wrong and go fix it. And people started crying in my office, which is surprising to me. Eventually my manager came in and said, hey, we need to talk about this. People don't want to work for you. You're overly harsh. You're not supportive, yada, yada. And, it really struck at that point. One is that obviously you need to be supportive as a boss, but, that I'm not managing myself. I'm managing other people.
Right.
And investing in the way they like to learn, the way that they like to be managed is really important. And getting that lesson, a year out of undergrad, was huge for me, because at that point in my career, I then started to ask, hey, how do you like to be managed? What are the things that matter to you? What are you trying to do? What do you want to achieve in your role? And those are questions I still ask today, but I find that a lot of managers who get into that role later in life, those are blind spots. And I think it was a great opportunity for me to sort of open my eyes very early, where I could learn and adjust the way that I did things. So very grateful for that early mistake, and the correction that happened.
Yeah, great early lesson. And it sounds like you had a great manager too that was able to point that out to you and get you back on track.
Absolutely.
Now, you went and got your MBA at Wharton while you're at the advisory board. Tell us a little bit about that thinking, because a lot of times that's a pivot for some people, right? They'll get their MBA and then go into a new career. So, walk us through kind of your thinking of going there and then obviously staying at advisory board afterwards.
Yeah, that was my intention. And I think, it is interesting. And I've heard this from, I remember when I first went to Yale, my college counselor said, there's kind of two types of people in situations you go in. People go into Yale and they say, gosh, I'm not smart enough. I'm, never going to be successful. And they get there and they realize, hey, I'm just as smart as everybody else. And there are other people who go in and say, hey, I'm smart, I'm brilliant. They get there and it's a humbling experience. I was in the latter camp. So, Phoenix, Arizona, I had done well in almost anything I did. And I got to Yale and I was like, wow, I'm not as smart as I thought I was. And just surrounded by brilliant people in a lot of different ways. And I think it was a bit of for me, smack in the face of, hey, a little bit of humility that you need to learn about yourself, which was obviously helpful for me. I had sort of the opposite experience at business school, which was, I'd worked for a relatively unknown company, the advisory board. I was in healthcare. I'd been doing that for 5 years. I wasn't an incredible entrepreneur. I wasn't working at McKinsey. I wasn't working at Goldman Sachs. And I was coming to Wharton, and, it was sort of my opportunity to kind of rub elbows with the big boys and, see what it's like to, work at one of these, big business schools and interact with these other people. And, I had the opposite experience as I did with undergrad, which was, wow, I'm just as good as all these other people. And in fact, the people I worked with at the advisory board were just as smart, and in some ways, a lot more pleasant to work with. And I thought that when I was going to go there, I needed to kind of go to business school to take the next step. So to be able to take on a big business and to be able to, work at a big consulting firm or investment banking firm to get to that next level. And it's sort of this, next rung in the ladder to get me to some future place that's going to, enable me to be a CEO or something like that one day. And what I learned is I didn't need to go to business school. It was a very expensive lesson. And I will say I enjoyed my time there, and, Wharton is a great school. And again, for me, from an intellectual perspective, it was great. I learned a ton. It was stimulating, but in terms of, did it help me in my path to bigger leadership roles? I needed to go there to learn that actually I didn't need to go to business school, which was, if I had just sort of had a little bit more confidence in myself, and, continue to follow my path, I could get there on my own. I didn't need business school to help me get there.
You eventually made the decision to leave the advisory board, though, and I think you had one other job before you went on to NorthStar. Tell us a little bit about that process, particularly after having been there for so long.
Yeah, and again, this gets back to sort of culture and people. We were acquired, so I think that is always a challenging moment. And we had
Right.
acquired companies previously at the advisory board, and I had been working on the integration side. And we probably acquired 7, 8 companies that I was involved with. And I'd always think like, boy, why are people so, challenged by this? Why is it so hard to retain talent when these changes happen? And it really is, when you're used to one culture and you're introduced suddenly to a new culture, that's difficult. And there's oftentimes reasons why people pick the company they're in, and a lot of that has to do with culture. So, what I found was that you definitely were in this, we were in a situation when the situation was reversed, where we were being acquired, where, Optum, big healthcare company, part of United, which is a Fortune 3 company, it's just they had a very different culture than the advisory board. And I tried to embrace it. I sort of worked with it. And I happened to be taking on a role within Optum where they wanted me to run growth for their hospital-based business and physician practice business. And I ended up interacting with almost none of the people who I had previously worked with
Hmm.
at the advisory board. And it was a great experience. I definitely enjoyed my time there. In some ways, it got me deeper on the physician practice area, which I eventually moved into from a NorthStar perspective. But I knew that it wasn't a place that I was going to be happy long term. And
Yeah.
maybe had I had a couple more experiences before I went to Optum, or if I had chosen to go to Optum, it would have been different. But sometimes when these cultures are forced upon you, it's tough to sort of stay.
So were you recruited over to the North Star? Was there, connections from the advisory board there? How did you kind of make that transition?
Yeah, and I had looked at a few different opportunities that came up, and it was, and again, this gets back to sort of what intrinsically motivates you, and a lot of pitches I'd gotten were private equity owned businesses, relatively small, call it 75 to 200 million in revenue kind of businesses in healthcare. And they pitched, hey, we're going to flip this company in 2 to 3 years. We need a CEO to come in and sort of scale it, and then you'll make a ton of money. And that was kind of the pitch. And it was sometimes it was a $75 million company, sometimes it was a $200 million company, but it was always about you're going to make a ton of money. Was the kind of That's the thing that you're going to do. And I just couldn't get excited about that.
Hmm.
And then, I got a call from Jeff Zients, who he's now President Biden's chief of staff, but at the time he was the CEO of Cranemere, which is a long-term capital company. And Jeff called me, and he was the CEO of the advisory board that I had worked pretty closely with before business school. So it was a mentor of mine. Asked me what I was doing and said, hey, I think I might have an opportunity for you.
Hmm.
And we went out to breakfast, and he told me about NorthStar Anesthesia. And, his pitch was, this is a space, the practice management business, where you've got a disconnect between the owners of a lot of these businesses, which are public companies or private equity firms that have very short time horizons, and the business itself, which is, anesthesiologists, hospitals, they don't ever want to not work together. So they'd be happy if, they just sort of stayed at the same place and were, perfectly fine doing that. And when you've got a company with a 3 to 5 year time horizon, and a employee base and a client that has a 10 to 20 year time horizon, that's a disconnect. And this is an opportunity to really rethink the way that care is delivered, and an actual capital structure that supports it. And that's what, he sort of pitched to me. And that was exciting. And then it was all about the business. It was all about the, what needs to change, what are the competitive dynamics. And that was exciting to me. So obviously working with someone who I'd worked with before, that was a big part of it. It was, probably a bigger step than I would have naturally stepped into had I taken a job from somebody who I didn't have a connection with. But it was that, hey, there's a higher purpose here. The sell was about the space and the sort of, this could be your next advisory board, was what really appealed to me.
And this has been a roll up, hasn't it, Adam? Did it start that way or continue that way?
Yeah, it's a little bit different in that, most roll-ups really focus on the top end of the market. So what they do is they look for the best practices that are happening in a given market, buy those practices, and then sort of those apex practices with great rates, with payers, and then they know how to run the practice. So as a management company, you kind of let the practice run itself, and then what you're doing is you're finding other practices to add on to it to create scale. Um, NorthStar actually is the opposite, which is they focus on the bottom of the market. So the vast majority of its growth is organic, and it's when the current group is not working out. And maybe it's that they don't have any business savvy, maybe it's a quality issue, maybe it's just a really hard place to recruit clinicians to. And as a result, the hospitals worry that they can't do their surgical business effectively. That's where NorthStar really specializes. So that was appealing to me as well, because it wasn't just about the financials, which is, find the right practices, put them together and let them run. This was much more of a business where you have to roll up your sleeves because nobody's hiring you because everything's going well. They're
Right.
hiring you because there's a problem and you've got to fix it. So to me, again, it's sort of like, hey, for every one of these new opportunities, it's an opportunity for us to improve care. And that was something that we were, obviously it was very exciting to me.
Awesome. And you've been there about 5 years. How would you say your leadership style has evolved since you've entered the corner office?
I think for me, I had managed a relatively large scale team previously, um, but stepping into the CEO role, I was really worried, to be honest, about how much of my role would be. How do you focus so much on strategy, and it's going to be much more about big picture items, and it's going to be about the finances, and getting deep in accounting and the reality is it's not that different. So what I'd say is I spend 95% of my time on people issues, and that
Right.
was surprising to me. But it's something I like to do, and I think that's been it's an area that I've definitely continued to grow in. I think it is, as you move into more and more senior roles, in a weird way, enabling your team becomes more and more important. So I'd say that the thing that I've had to learn more and more is that it's hard for me to personally direct things. So to get things done, I'm almost always operating through people.
Right.
And that is a different skill set, and it exercises different muscles. And I think it's really important to make sure you've got the right team, and that you are supporting them. And in a weird way, that's kind of, as I see my job now, is that less about, hey, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and it's more about how do I enable my team to be successful. And if I do that, then the company seems to do pretty well.
You talked earlier about the importance of culture, particularly at the advisory board. What would you say is unusual or unique about North Star's culture?
It's it. What I would say is there is actually something that I picked up from Optum, which was a phrase: "assume positive intent."
Hmm.
And
That's important in any relationship.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, especially in the home front. But
No question.
but I will say it is particularly important in healthcare, and I think in a world where it always feels like there's a lot of fingers being pointed, especially now, assuming positive intent of your clients, assuming positive intent of your coworkers, that is a really, really important value to drive. And I think that that is one of the things that I've really tried to push on our teams. And it is flowing through. And I think when you hear feedback on NorthStar about much more of a team based approach, being supportive, thinking about the whole group, I think when you hear conversations with our clients, the hospitals and health systems, or the surgeons, they talk about that we're very collaborative with them. I think a lot of that comes back to assuming positive intent. And somebody can send an email that you can read into, and spiral down. But if you sort of step back and say, hey, let's assume that they meant this positively, it completely changes the way that you approach that problem. And I
Mm.
think that that's something that it's a relatively simple thing, but it really drives a lot of what I'd argue is our differentiation in the market, is that we're not about pointing fingers. We're about sort of digging in, solving problems. And I think that comes from, not spiraling out when you hear something that, you may take the wrong way.
Yeah, focus on getting the job done. Love that. What do you look for, Adam, when you're making bets on the people you invest in and hire, or the companies that you're purchasing, bringing into the group?
It really, a lot of this again is what I learned at the advisory board. I look much more at track record. So, who are people that I trust that speak highly of this person, or that they have been successful in the things that they've done in the past. So, unlike the, person who looks at the, Yale and Wharton resume,
Hmm.
what I'm looking for is, hey, do I know somebody who knows somebody, um, and can speak very highly of them and talk about how they've made progression. When I'm looking at an employee for promotion, again, it's less about their background. It's more, have they, in their existing roles, continue to be successful in all the challenges that they've met. And when that's the case, I want to give them more responsibility. And it's important, when you're doing that, to also give space to fail. And I think that's something where, um, it's hard, because I think you want to push your team, you want to give them more. They're not always going to be able to step up to that immediately, and making them feel comfortable trying and failing, I think, is important, because if you sort of set that bar too high, and they don't reach it, it's a great way to lose talent.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we've spent a lot of time trying to instill, is this comfort with failure.
As you've been growing, are you still involved in quite a few of the interviewing process with new hires?
I am. Certainly, again, that gets to the HR nature of what I do. We're still while we're, over $1 billion in revenue as a company, we're still a relatively small corporate office. So it does enable me to get to know, uh, pretty, get to know people pretty deep in the organization. So I do like to be involved in the interview process. Again, less the actual, always the, hey, 15, 20 minutes. I'm usually selling at that point. It's more about, do I know somebody through my connections? Who have we talked to has worked with this person before? So that, you've got a little bit of a third party reference that, you trust. I find when that's the case, those hires tend to be much more successful than somebody who aced the interview, but that you've got no connectivity to.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite interview question you like to ask, particularly after someone's been screened, say, by 4 or 5 other people within the organization, by the time they get to you?
Yeah, my question is, tell me about a time that you failed and what you learned from that experience.
Mm.
And I do think, the getting through adversity is important, because, it hits everybody. And, um, good experiences, bad experiences, everybody has them. I think what really differentiates is the people who actually can learn from those experiences, about themselves. And I think that is one of the things I'm looking for. It's not so much, here's a great story about failure and what I did differently. It's really is there any insight into, themselves that they're taking away from that experience, and that, knowing themselves well, that tends to create great leaders.
We're now living kind of in a post-COVID world, and I know we didn't get into it, but a lot of impact on your organization during that period, and you managed through that and are coming out the other side. As you look ahead, what would you say are some of the biggest changes that you've made in order to really kind of prepare you for what may be coming next, but more importantly, the learnings that came out of that, very tough couple of years that the healthcare industry went through?
Yeah, I think it's, obviously providing resources for people during challenging times. You find COVID obviously was the extreme version of it, but things that are happening in the world can, be tough on the teams, both locally and internationally. So I think just making sure that you've got lots of resources for people are important. I think a big part of that is regionalization. So, we had kind of had a corporate office, and that makes a lot of sense, because you're supporting a geographically diverse group and you want scale and things like that. But I think it is important for us to be local with the teams whenever we can. So we've, been really opting for much more of a regional model when it comes to support services like HR, business partners like our operations teams so that we can be close to our clinicians, not just in terms of, phone calls and emails, but physically actually be able to get there. Because it is weird in in the corporate world, people are working from home. You can't do that when you're in healthcare and you're a
Right.
clinician. You've got to be at the hospital. So we've got a team that, 90% of our team members are actually physically there every day that they're working. And our corporate teams, having them in a location where they can go sort of meet them there, I think is really important for us. So that's something that we've really adjusted to over the last couple of years.
Adam, you've been very generous with your time, but we always have one last question for all our CEO guests, and that's what kind of career and life advice would you give to someone that maybe has, is mid-career and has their eyes on the corner office someday?
For me, I think it's all about find people that you enjoy working with. And that is going to make you much more successful. I find that if I look at all the important sort of steps I've taken in my career, it's been because of a relationship that I had with somebody else and one that I had created at work. And, those are the people that you trust when you're taking on a new job, not going in blindly, but having somebody who's been there or knows somebody who's there really helps with that. So I think for me, rather than run at the best title or the most challenging role, it's find an environment where you like the people you're working with, because I think that's going to help you more than anything else. And if you look around and you say, boy, these are miserable people to work with,
You're not in the
find
right
someplace
place.
else. Exactly.
I love it. Wise counsel, Adam. Adam Spiegel, Chief Executive Officer at NorthStar Anesthesia. Thank you so very much for sharing your journey into the corner office.
Thanks for having me, Brand.
Thank you for listening to Into the Corner Office with Brant Hanley. We hope you enjoyed hearing our guest CEO story as much as we did. If you want to hear more CEOs reveal their journey into the corner office, please subscribe via iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. For more information about Brant, Resource Options International, and the mighty middle market, visit www.goforroi.com. We look forward to having you join us for our next episode.